have big pharmaceutical corporations and big food corporations captured the practice of medicine? Have they literally kidnapped evidence-based medicine? I think these are very important and relevant questions that all of us should be asking, but especially this is a topic that should be on the radar of doctors and other healthcare practitioners and dietitians and nutritionists who are actively practicing with patients on a daily basis. I think this question should be at the forefront of anyone's mind who's practicing medicine or who is being subjected to the practice of medicine. And this includes all patients around the world. Today, I have the great honor and pleasure of being joined by Dr. Aseem Malhotra, who is a practicing cardiologist and increasingly a philosopher of medicine and a theoretician of medical practice, and someone who is moving the needle of how doctors practice medicine. Very often we don't get information that, hey, your diet is really, really important. And in many cases and in many countries, doctors don't have access to the proper testing that would reveal that you have hyperinsulinemia or you have prediabetes or you have fatty liver. These things are very important, and many doctors don't have access to the literal testing that's available in many countries that would reveal hyperinsulinemia or metabolic disease. I'm being joined now by Dr. Malhotra. Let me add him. Hello, doctor. How's it going? He's getting set up here. We'll give him a minute. I can see you, doctor, but I can't hear you. Now turn your microphone back on and you should be good to go. It says you've got your mic turned off, maybe in the app. Do you see the button? Can you hear me? Okay. Can you hear me, doctor?
Okay.
There we go. Beautiful. Beautiful.
You can hear me, but I can't hear you very well.
I can hear you very well.
Okay, hold on. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I hear you fine.
Okay.
Excellent. Welcome. We've been trying to make this happen for months. I feel like that Dr. Malhotra is my brother from another mother across the ocean. So many of our views align, and so many of our stances on things in medicine and nutrition.
Absolutely.
So welcome, doctor. It's an honor to have you here. For those two people in my audience who don't know who you are, give us a brief little intro of who you are and why the work you're doing is so important.
Hi, thanks, Ken. It's lovely to be able to chat to you finally. So I'm a consultant cardiologist. I've been a qualified doctor now for over 21 years. I initially trained as an interventional cardiologist, so in layman's term, doing keyhole heart surgery, and that's what I specialized in. But around sort of 10 years ago, I started to drift a little bit more down the prevention side, partly because, as you know, Ken, something that you're very well aware of, is that we have this big problem in healthcare right now, adversely affecting the population. Two big issues. One is over-medicated population, and linked to people who are suffering from chronic disease because of lifestyle. And I decided that I was going to start, a journey where I was going to understand the evidence a bit more on the lifestyle interventions. And what I discovered ultimately is that, a lot of clinical decision-making for doctors and for people making health decisions has been corrupted by very powerful vested interests by big pharma, big food. And in addition to trying, obviously, to improve my patient outcomes with the evolved science and evolved evidence, I then became a campaigner to expose that corruption so that the whole system ultimately will benefit and we can improve population health.
And I think that's a beautiful thing. The corruption that you and I are fighting is so insidious. It's so subtle that for many people, including many doctors, it doesn't even look like corruption. So I want people to understand what we're fighting against here is not that a Pfizer rep or a Merck rep goes to your doctor's office and says, here's $5,000. I need you to say the following thing. That's not what we're talking about here. This is much more subtle. This is a much deeper corruption. And many people who haven't seen this sort of corruption, doctor, they think, well, nobody's paying my doctor off to say these things to me. Why are you calling this corruption? Let's start with Big Pharma. And I'm happy for this conversation to lead wherever it goes. And definitely I want to consider the effects of what's happened over the last 2 years, but let's try to avoid any key phrases that might get this video throttled or otherwise curtailed. But definitely let's start with Big Pharma. How have they captured evidence-based medicine? How have they affected the daily practice of just the routine GP or family doctor in a way that's harmful to patients?
Yeah, it's a great point, Ken. So, and you're absolutely right. I think this is a more subtle, sort of visible and invisible, unchecked power of these pharmaceutical industries that ultimately, because of their primary motive, which is to make profit, not to give you the best treatment, that ultimately has an impact in the consultation room. So doctors, first and foremost, I still believe that the overwhelming majority of people that go into medicine, Ken, doctors, people in healthcare, nurses, for example, they do it because they genuinely want to help patients, and they come from a very strong background of having, a powerful moral compass, if you like. So, people who tend to go in medicine tend to be people who obviously are bright, are hardworking, but also people who genuinely have very high levels of integrity. So we're not at all, I'm not pointing fingers at doctors here, but let's try and explain actually the problems that we're discussing in a bit more detail. So if we first understand and accept that the drug industry have a fiduciary obligation to make profit for their shareholders, right? And that then they influence clinical decision-making through guidelines and then through what they put out through medical journals. So to cite, a chap I call the Stephen Hawking of medicine, Professor John Ioannidis, professor of medicine and statistics at the University of Stanford, and he's the most cited medical researcher in the world. He wrote a paper in 2017, which really summarizes it very well, and people can look this up. It's called How to Survive the Medical Misinformation Mess. And he makes some key points. So first and foremost, he says most published research is misleading, at least to some degree. And in fact, a previous paper he'd written in PLOS One many years before that, he actually said most published research findings are false. So he says that if we accept that to start with, and that's because the drug industry ultimately design trials and they exaggerate the benefits and safety of their drugs. So, and all of this ultimately contributes to over-medication, overuse, underuse of other innovative, important, either safer and cheaper medicines, but also innovation around lifestyle, avoidable adverse events, waste, and of course, considerable and missed opportunities for giving the right patient the right treatment at the right time. And the estimates, Ken, on this, when you look at American healthcare, it's thought that 30 to 50% of all healthcare activity in the United States brings no benefit to patients. We're talking about you spend 18% of your GDP, almost $3.5 trillion healthcare industry. Imagine almost 50% of that brings no healthcare benefit to patients. And that's because of all these factors. So the question is, first and foremost, the acknowledgement that most research findings are misleading or false. But this is a key point, which you've raised. Most doctors are not aware of this problem, right? They trust what they're being told. And then even if they're aware of it, they then don't have the necessary skills. That's part of medical training and postgraduate training to critically evaluate data. And then last but not least, patients and families then don't get information conveyed to them in a way that they can understand in keeping with the principles of informed consent and ethical evidence-based medicine. So if, for example, Ken, we talk about statins, right? I've done a lot of work on statins. I know you understand the whole issue around statins very well. But if you break down the data on the benefits of statins in most people who are prescribed them in the US and around the world, so these are people who are not high risk of heart disease or certainly haven't had a heart attack, then we know that statin benefit, taking it religiously every day for 5 years, based upon industry-sponsored trials, which again are likely to exaggerate the benefit, so this is probably best case scenario, means that you're going to get a 1% benefit, a 1 in 100 chance that will prevent a non-fatal heart attack or stroke in the next 5 years, but will not prolong your life. But most patients are not told this, right? And then they're not then making informed decisions. And when you look at other research, when patients are given information this way in absolute terms, most of them choose not to take the pill. So imagine all that over medication. Think about the scenario, I'm sure you see it quite often, of the patient that comes in, he's on the statin, his cholesterol's low, he's got the illusion of protection in many ways, and then he thinks he can eat junk food, right?
Yes.
And actually the net result of that is you're probably increasing his insulin resistance and increasing his risk of a heart attack, and he doesn't even realize it.
Yes.
So this is just one sort of example of the complete healthcare system failure we're in. And the reason I choose statins is it has been the most lucrative and prescribed drug, certainly one of the most in the history of, in the last few, in the history of modern medicine. $1 trillion industry, almost 1 billion people prescribe the drug, and most of those people don't realize they're not going to benefit from it.
Absolutely. And I love what you said earlier, because the vast majority of doctors and other healthcare providers are ethical and are moral. And if Sanofi came to them in the back room and said, here's $5,000, I need you to say the following things, 99.9% of them would say, F you, get out of my office. But when we have a big pharmaceutical industry like we have, and so many people in the US don't realize this, that when a big pharmaceutical house has a new drug, they design the research studies. Very often, the majority, if not all of the researchers, are either employees or independent contractors, or they own stock in the company. And then here's the final thing that almost no layman understands, but many doctors don't know, is if that company, if they come up with the trial results that don't show an effect, they have no legal or any compulsion to publish that negative study. They'll bury that negative study. That's considered proprietary information, at least in the US, by the federal government. It's protected by law. And so if anybody whistleblows that, they can get in trouble. And so this pharmaceutical house could run 7 or 8 trials before they find one trial that does show a benefit. And in very many cases, as you know, it's a 1% benefit over placebo. They have also no fiduciary duty to compare it with the current standard of care medicine. They can compare it to placebo. And if it has a 1% benefit over placebo, now they get FDA approved, and now they can make $1 billion. But nobody, including doctors, ever sees the studies that showed no benefit or that showed harm. They get to hide those. How do doctors not know that? And I've encountered thousands of doctors online are like, what? No, that can't be right. They have to publish all the data. No, my friends, no, they don't. Let's talk about that for a minute, doctor.
Yeah, no, Ken, absolutely. So I think where the real corruption of money happens is at the higher levels of power in the medical establishment. So even though we know that the pharmaceutical industry are there to make profit for their shareholders, that's a legal responsibility. The real scandals are these: the regulators fail to prevent misconduct by industry, and we'll talk about that shortly, and that influential, powerful doctors on guideline boards, academic institutions, and medical journals, this is where the scandal is, who have a responsibility to scientific integrity and patients, they collude with industry for financial gain. So that's really where the power is exerted. And of course, many doctors, and it's interesting, Ken, I've been on this big journey, and we'll come on to it later, around understanding the true benefits and the potential harms of some of these COVID vaccines. And, I spoke to many doctors actually get their information from the mainstream media. Now, who's controlling the mainstream media? Certainly in the United States, 80% of the mainstream media, print and broadcast media, is owned by 7 corporations, if I'm not wrong. And a lot of those, are pushing their own interests. So people are only getting half the truth or misleading information, and they believe it to be accurate. And doctors are also the same. I spoke to the chairman of the British Medical Association not so long ago. I gave a talk at their annual conference, and I presented data. In fact, the title of my talk was "The Corporate Capture of Medicine and Public Health." And halfway through my talk, I presented information from an investigation in the BMJ, where I highlighted that the FDA, and in our country we call it the MHRA, the regulator, gets 86% of its funding from pharma, the FDA 65%. And he's a chairman of the BMA, and he didn't believe it. As in, he was gobsmacked. He thought, really? He couldn't. So if the chairman of the British Medical Association, who's so responsible for putting out policy, doesn't even know that the information he's getting or the regulators are so conflicted. How do you expect the jobbing doctor on the ground to know that?
Absolutely right. Now, if you guys watching, we got 1,000 people watching. If you're already gobsmacked by some of the stuff you've heard in this, just think what your friends are going to think about it. Please click the share button right now and share this on your favorite social media. This information has to get out there, because if the chairman of the BMJ doesn't know this, there's a high likelihood that your doctor also doesn't know this. So please share this with your friends, your family, and maybe even your doctor. So let's talk about your particular experience in the UK, because we've got people from all over the world watching this. What has been, were you made aware of this? Because I know you're probably like me, early in your medical practice, you had no idea about any of this stuff. You trusted the drug reps and you trusted the supplements that came with your medical journals. Now, you didn't realize they're literally printed, designed, written, and they're just an infomercial. Many doctors don't realize that. What woke you up?
Yeah, I think it was, so it's interesting. It was really my patient contact. So I qualified as a doctor in 2001. And over a sort of 10-year period, I noticed more and more patients intuitively. I was feeling more strain on the healthcare system, more people coming in with chronic disease, more pills. And I thought, hold on, what's going on here? Because if we were doing things accurately or to the best available evidence for patients, why are they getting sicker? And really, that started me on my investigation. And of course, initially, I focused on obesity. And then different things happened. And I think one of the things that really woke me up to this area was the BMJ, the British formerly known as the British Medical Journal, in 2012 started a campaign called Too Much Medicine. And I started reading articles in them, and I was shocked, with what I was hearing around corruption of research. And then Peter Gosha, the former co-founder of the Cochrane Collaboration, just to give people some perspective how bad this problem is. It's not a small issue, it's a massive public health issue. His own analysis suggests that the third most common cause of death after heart disease and cancer is side effects of prescribed medications, what your doctor prescribes for you. And he said that's mostly preventable. And again, the root cause is the information that doctors make decisions on exaggerates the safety and the benefits of those drugs. So for me, that kind of started me on a journey. And then I thought, let me try and understand this in more detail and get to the roots of it. And then as a campaigner and an activist, once I was aware of this, I thought this needs to get mainstream attention. So I then became a kind of a medium, if you like, Ken, with my clinical experience, and to try and get this stuff into the mainstream. And the reason I did that is I've been inspired by revolutionaries throughout history, whether it was Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi. And one of the key philosophies of these people is, people want the truth and people hate injustice, right? And when you've got injustice going on, the way you change the system is by making the injustice visible. And rightly or wrongly, the most important, impactful platform for that, Ken, is the mainstream media. So I then initially started writing articles in the Observer newspaper. I've been writing since I was, a junior doctor. In fact, since I was at school, I wrote an article in my school newspaper, it became the National School Newspaper of the Year Award. So I always had an interest in writing. And I think that helped me. And then I started to articulate this in articles. Then I started writing for the BMJ. They would press release it. I then thought, if I'm going to say something, I only want to write about something I think is important to everybody. And therefore, if I do that, I will do everything I can to maximize its impact. And, stuff I did on sugar, raising the harms of sugar and cholesterol and statins and low carb diets and all that. Those principles, I always then try to get my medical journal pieces into the mainstream, and quite successfully, to try and shift the opinion of people and help them understand this. So that's really the journey I've been on. But at the end of the day, it's all about, understanding, going back to the patient in the consultation room. How can I be the very best possible doctor I can be for that patient? And the two components, even in that discussion, are clinical history taking, but then you have to have the full knowledge of the information around any condition and the drugs around it and the benefits and harms. But also the other component is empathy, right? Really, understanding what the patient wants. I mean, we come back to a very simple, elegant analytical framework, Ken, for teaching and practicing medicine, which I think if most doctors fully understood properly, we could solve this problem very quickly. So we want to improve patient outcomes. It's called the evidence-based medicine triad. And to do that, we use our clinical experience, our clinical intuition, our expertise, the best available evidence, and then last but not least, which is crucial, taking into consideration individual patient preferences and values. Now, if one understands that best available evidence has become an illusion or been corrupted by big pharma, and that we're not actually translating even that information in a way that's, the way that we should ethically give that information to patients in terms of transparent communication, risk and benefits. Of course, at best, we're going to get suboptimal outcomes for our patients, and at worst, we're going to do harm. And that's where we're at. And if you look at the healthcare systems around the world, the population health, it's going in the wrong direction.
Yep.
And my hypothesis is one of the major factors behind that is because we are not really practicing evidence-based medicine in an ethical way.
Right. And I think I can remember early in my career when I first came upon the concept of evidence-based medicine in my residency training, I was immediately enthralled. I was like, yes, I want every one of my recommendations to be evidence-based. But people don't understand there's a hierarchy of evidence, right? And so the double-blind randomized controlled trial in humans, that's the kind of the penultimate. But very often when I get my American Family Physician, this is my journal for my specialty, right? And they actually have a little chart with each article. This is the level of evidence that we use to base this on. And so level A evidence would be randomized controlled trials or really strenuous trials with lots of participants. Level B is a little less than that, lots of case controls and that sort of thing. Then level C is consensus of the experts. And very often, all of the recommendations in an article in the American Family Physician will all be level of evidence C, which means literally there's no meaningful research that went into the writing of that article whatsoever. It's all consensus, which some people would call eminence-based medicine. But the average family doctor is busy. They don't have time to look into all this stuff like you and I do. They just basically read the title and then the summary and go, okay, that's how I should practice medicine. We've got people watching from Poland. We got people from Zambia. We got people from South Africa. You guys tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? What city, what state, what country? And so what doctors I feel like are left with is they feel like the only tool that they have to help their patients is their prescription pad, which is now their electronic medical record. No doctor does any doctor have a prescription pad anymore? I started out with one, but I don't have one anymore. But let's talk about that, because what it leaves doctors with is this almost magical belief that the thing that I should do to help my patients is to prescribe them a pharmaceutical. And many doctors feel like the only thing that they can do that's evidence-based is to prescribe them a pharmaceutical. And most doctors seem to have a paralysis when it comes to de-prescribing. They almost feel like that might be doing harm, although you and I are very well aware of the dangers of polypharmacy. And indeed, there's been very little research done on what happens to a patient, especially an elderly patient, when they're on 4, 5, 6, 7 medications. The possible drug interactions go up exponentially, and there's really been no research done on that whatsoever. Why are doctors so afraid, Dr. Aseem Malhotra, to de-prescribe a medication that at best is giving their patient a 1% benefit?
Yeah, I think, again, it's a combination of ignorance and the illusion of knowledge. And I think many doctors themselves, it sounds strange, but don't have a good understanding of the actual true benefits and harms of those drugs. And then they don't communicate that to the patient. So actually what they're doing, and they don't even realize it, they are ultimately just being, I don't know, the word would be puppets of big pharma, really, a vested interest, and they don't even realize it because we're not trained in that way, Ken, as well. I mean, I wasn't taught about transparent communication, risk of benefit in medical school. I learned a lot of this stuff later on. And once I realized that this is actually the way we should be doing stuff, and actually the system stopped, because actually, if you think about it, if you imagine these companies having so much power and influence, if people were actually engaging in informed consent in the way we've discussed, say, for example, with statins, and you can apply this to diabetes drugs, blood pressure pills, for example, many drug companies probably would go bust overnight, Ken. People would choose through informed consent not to take the pill. And of course, they are going to do everything they can to stop that happening or delay it happening. But the truth is the truth. And we know that, unfortunately, these industries, these companies, most of the top 10 drug companies, certainly in the last 2 decades, have been found guilty of major fraud. illegal marketing of drugs, hiding data on harms, manipulation of
Yep.
results,
Yep.
being fined billions and
guarantee you,
billions.
doctor, I guarantee you there are people watching this right now who don't really believe what you said. They're like, well, he seems like a trustworthy guy, but I don't believe that. All you guys, after this video is over, I want you to just go to your internet search engine and type in Big Pharma felony. Just type that search in. And what you're going to see is article after article that somehow doesn't really get promoted by the biggest news outlets. It might have just a one story run for just a few minutes, and then it disappears because the majority of CNN and Fox News and MSNBC and BBC, a majority of their advertising comes from Big Pharma. And so if they got too froggy running these stories and just pounding this message home that big pharmaceutical companies have been charged with some of the biggest felony financial penalties in the world, bigger than the big chemical factories, bigger than big industry, humongous fines. They don't dwell on that for some reason. Somehow that disappears down the memory hole very, very quickly.
Yeah, Ken. I mean, in fact, I can be very precise on this because I've written about it in detail. So between 2009 and 2014, for example, and it's much more now, most of the top 10 companies paid fines totaling, most of it in the US as well, about $13 billion for all this, fraud essentially. But to give you one very clear example, because I think people, this is quite powerful and a useful, interesting example for people that they may be able to relate to. So the Vioxx scandal, as you may well remember, this was a drug that was marketed and promoted by and approved, by the regulator, by the drug company Merck. It was initially thought to be an anti-inflammatory that was going to be better than ibuprofen, right, as a painkiller, but with less problems with the stomach. And that's how it was promoted. Yep. And ultimately, it was found that the data behind the trials was fraudulent. It doubled the risk of heart attack. And Merck were fined $950 million in 2011. But these are the key points. They ultimately end up making more money from the sales and marketing of the drug than they did from, obviously, the fines. No one got fired. No one lost their job. And when internal emails during the litigation were uncovered, it was found, it wasn't just a mistake. The chief scientist of Merck sent an email, around at the very beginning, just after it had been approved, essentially saying and accepting there was a problem with the heart disease risk or heart attack risk. And words to the effect of, it's unfortunate about the cardiovascular effect of this drug, but the drug will do well and we will do well. Now, yep. That is just absolutely shocking. And when I give lectures, I give this example and I ask people, what do you call this? And people shout all sorts of stuff from criminal, to madness, to psychopath or whatever. And that brings me on to something else that when you look at the way that a lot of these companies have operated, Ken, because they're purely for making profit. One of the most eminent experts in forensic psychology, Dr. Robert Hare, in the early 2000s, in a book called The Corporation and in a documentary called The Corporation, made by law professor Joel Bakan, he was involved in the original international psychiatric DSM criteria diagnosis for psychopath. And he says many of these companies, and in the book, he actually calls out Big Pharma. And he says often the way that they work as an entity, not the individuals within them, it's a system issue, but the way that the entity that Big Pharma is, that they operate, actually fulfills diagnostic criteria for psychopath, right? 100%. So what does that mean? Conning others for profit, deceitfulness, callous unconcern for harm to others, right? This is exactly what they do. And there's lots of examples throughout history, but you're right. Most people don't know this because it's not through the mainstream media. You can find it if you look for it, but a lot of our decisions are influenced by a narrative pushed through the mainstream, which is influenced by Big Pharma.
Yep,
right?
100%
people
agree.
have this perception about medicine is great, and Fauci goes on and talks about trust the science, which in fact is actually the most unscientific statement I've ever heard, because as you know, medicine's not an exact science, right? It's an applied science. It's the art of probabilities. It's the science of human beings. Absolutely. And that's where we're at.
Yes, we're going to get to the trust the science in just a minute. And I'm going to ask Dr. Malhotra a question at the end of this video that's going to be directly applicable to your health. So stick around to hear that question. I want to talk about the Vioxx thing for just a moment, because this happened early in my medical practice career. I remember the Vioxx drug representative coming to my office, bringing a bunch of samples and be like, dude, this is the shit, okay? This is going to help their pain better than ibuprofen. It protects their stomach. It's not going to cause ulcers. And I was like, I was blown away. And so I started handing out the samples, blindly believing the drug rep and the little supplement study that he handed me. And all my patients were raving like, oh, yeah, that stuff works good. I'm so glad because, I had a bleeding ulcer with the ibuprofen or with the naproxen before. I love this Vioxx. And I was so unaware back then, doctor, that when all the lawsuits started to happen, I didn't throw my Vioxx samples away because there were patients calling me saying, please, if you've got any samples left, save those for me because they help my arthritis so much. But I blindly trusted the corporation. I blindly trusted the drug representative that had been in my office. And then I trusted my patient's feedback. It helps. And I haven't seen any patients just drop dead from taking Vioxx. This is one of the many harms I did early in my medical career. And that's why I do exactly what I do now, is trying to make up for the harm that I did because of my own ignorance. So Vioxx was known by the Merck Corporation to be harmful. Cardiac danger. They knew this. It's in their uncovered emails during the lawsuit, but the average doctor has no idea of what goes on. And I think this is a cognitive dissonance issue for just the regular person watching this right now. They're like, I would never do that. That's the normal response of any normal ethical person. They're like, I would never, if I knew that was bad, I would not have done that. And this is what everybody needs to understand. The difference between corporate ethics and personal ethics. I wouldn't have done what I had done had I known that. That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
But at the corporate level, that's not how they think about things. They have corporate attorneys, they have corporate accountants. We call them bean counters. And they literally do the math. How many lawsuits are we probably going to get from this? How much? What are we going to make in profits? And then they weigh those two numbers together and say, oh, we're still going to make $10 billion. Proceed. For most people, this sounds alien. This sounds demonic. But this is how corporations make daily decisions. And so just because you haven't heard of a lawsuit from this corporation or that corporation yet, just give it time. Just wait for one whistleblower to come out, because this is how it's done at a billion-dollar corporate level. But the average person, this sounds like a demonic possession or something. They're like, no rational, normal human being would ever sign off on that. Yes, my friends, this happens on a daily basis. It's happening right now at big pharmaceutical companies. We just haven't uncovered the evidence because there has been no discovery yet. Just wait and just be patient. So over the last
Ken, very briefly on that point, the consequences of Vioxx were devastating. It's thought that 60,000 Americans were killed because of Vioxx, which is more Americans that were killed in Vietnam. That's just one drug that we know of.
That's right, that we know of currently. So over the last 2 years, we've been told, it's been drummed into our head from all mainstream media outlets to trust the science. And you hit on this earlier, but I want to come back to this. I want to give you the floor. I want you to rip to shreds this concept that we must trust the science. How is this wrong? What should we do instead?
Yeah, no. So this is obviously the phrase that was propagated by Anthony Fauci. And the first thing I would say, Ken, is that, medicine itself is not an exact science like, say, physics or chemistry. Okay, it's an applied science. It's a social science. It's a science of human beings. Human beings are dynamic, and in many ways, it's an art, and it's a use of probabilities from data, and we make decisions and we get our clinical experience. But one of the things that we're taught at medical school is that 50% of what you learn at medical school will turn out to be either outdated or dead wrong within 5 years of your graduation. And the trouble is, nobody can tell you which half. So you have to learn on your own. So trust the science in itself is actually when it comes to medicine, is one of the most unscientific statements I've ever heard. And in fact, when we go back to, I've come up with this new concept or phrase saying we should talk about now the psychopathic determinants of health, as in a psychopathic entity that's influencing our lives. In essence, I don't think he necessarily meant this deliberately, but we know this now with what's been emerging recently, when Anthony Fauci said trust the science, in effect, he was saying trust the psychopath. And that's why we're in the mess that we're in.
Yep, I totally agree. And I think a lot of people who before just blindly trusted their doctor. They blindly trusted CNN or Fox News or BBC or whatever news outlet that they felt comfortable watching. They just blindly trusted them because we didn't have any real indication before that maybe we should question every single damn thing we hear from the newspaper or the television or the internet. Maybe we should question all of that. People didn't have that on the radar, but I think events of the last 2 years have made it clear to a very large percentage of people, some who are not even ready to admit it yet to themselves, that you should not trust the big corporations and the mainstream media. You shouldn't trust anybody blindly with your health ever. What do you have to say about that? What?
Yeah, it's a great point, Ken.
First of all, I want to know more about trust the science. What doctor, what PhD researcher, who would even, I don't even think a physicist or a mathematician would say that, because when you get to the edge of physical science or mathematical science, you can't say trust the science either, because there's still a lot of shit we don't know. What made it okay for an MD or a PhD to get on mainstream television and say we should just trust the science? Where did that come from?
Yeah, I think that was essentially a way of controlling people, Ken. I think that's what Fauci wanted to do, is influence people. Trust the science, of course, applied to whether it was masks or lockdowns or the vaccine. You know, it was like, this is the absolute truth. This is what you should do. This is what's going to benefit you. And that was just a way of, I think, getting people to conform to government policy. But unfortunately, government is being controlled or is in bed with pharma, right? In many ways, or other vested interests, right? Whether it's even food industry. And that's the problem. That's the real problem. The root of that statement doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. So, and then the question have asked me as well, why are doctors just falling for this? Well, certainly the last 2 years, it's been a very different set of circumstances. So we had this emergency. We'll have lived through a time which we've never experienced before. And of course, a lot of the way that it affected us, and we were all there at the beginning. I hope many people have moved to a better place now, but we were gripped by fear, right? When we saw this, on the TV, all these people dying in, China and Italy and everything else. And of course, all our hospitals being overloaded, certainly with vulnerable people, older and vulnerable people with COVID, then obviously it scared us. And one of the things about fear, Ken, is it clouds our ability to engage in critical thinking. And, and of course, the other thing that's really important when we look about numbers and about COVID risk, and let's just break it down, without understanding the numbers involved, and I'll talk about that in a second, I'll expand on COVID risk, for example. Without understanding the numbers involved, the public, patients, even doctors, are vulnerable to exploitation of their hopes and fears and anxieties by political and commercial interests. So, for example, earlier on in the pandemic, one survey of 50 American adults revealed that they thought their risk of being hospitalized with COVID, Ken, was 50%, 1 in 2, when the actual figure was far less than 1%, right? But imagine that level of fear and how that influenced behavior. And of course, that's why we have to come back to kind of some cold, hard facts. And that wasn't, that wasn't disseminated very well in the mainstream media, probably for good reasons. Some of it is just clickbait and they like to create fear or whatever. But if information had been broken down to people in that sort of way, people would have been less scared. And of course, that's a good thing, right? Because the fear and anxiety has probably contributed massively to worsening mental health.
Absolutely.
So I think that the fear crowds critical thinking. And then the other issue now, moving forward, to try and actually have a rational discussion on this issue, whether it's about whether lockdowns were the right thing. And we know now, clearly they weren't the right way forward. They've caused more harm than good. Masks, the evidence on that is very, very shaky about benefit. To be honest, I would go, and this is my opinion, looking at the evidence, there's absolutely no benefit in preventing transmission whatsoever. And there's so many harms associated with the mask psychologically, but also I'm seeing patients that are having problems with having these masks on for a long time. They're inhaling these microfibers and having respiratory problems now. So it's not that it doesn't come without harms. And then, of course, we can move on to the discussion of the vaccine if you want to talk about that shortly. But one of the things that is impeding the discussion of some of the things that people genuinely believed and took as gospel truth, which is the opposite now, is something called willful blindness. So it's when human beings turn a blind eye to the truth, in order to feel safe, reduce anxiety, avoid conflict, and to protect their prestige and reputations. And many of the establishment now, instead of saying, listen, we got it wrong, we should have done better, we're going to work to making sure that this never happens again by improving the system, they're not doing that. They're burying their heads in the sand and they're carrying on with the same nonsense.
Yes, absolutely. And I think what you just touched on is another great example of this subtle this subtle criminal activity. So you've got a mainstream reporter. They have a duty to their network to get views, to get eyeballs, either on the article they wrote or on the video they made. So I don't think that any big pharmaceutical representatives went to a big, well-known reporter and said, here's 10 grand. I need you to scare the shit out of everybody about this virus. And so that way we can make a lot more money. But anybody knows you're much more likely to click on an article or a video if it's got a scary title. And so reporters want to be successful. They want to be wealthy. They want to be respected. And so they are going to tweak their titles to invoke that fear in you. That's just what they're going to do. They weren't paid off to do that. And so Big Pharma can just sit back and let the reporters do their job of getting clicks and getting eyeballs, and that's going to increase pharma profits. It's very subtle. It's not them handing over $100 euro notes or $100 pound notes. That's not how this works. This is a much higher level of subtlety.
And they also rely on the fact that they know psychologically people. You know, it's quite a big deal for people to change their minds and then to admit they were wrong, right? So they'll rely on the fact that they've deceived us from the beginning. They've got people indoctrinated, and it's not going to be easy for a lot of those reporters and journalists to say, hold on a minute, what I was saying, whether it was, this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated or that kind of nonsense, right? It's not going to be easy for them to admit they were wrong. There's a saying from John Kenneth Galbraith, the Canadian-American economist, that is faced with the choice between changing one's mind and proving there's no reason to do so, almost everybody gets busy on the proof. Absolutely. So because they were so indoctrinated, the barrier, but it's the only way forward. Truth is the only way that we're going to kind of redeem the world from this mental and physical chronic disease problem that we've been trying to manage for many years, not very well. And then on top of that, you have a fast pandemic with COVID exploiting a slow pandemic of chronic disease, and everything's come together. And we're actually much worse off than we were even before the pandemic.
And I think everybody is aware that we have not witnessed a press conference where a big television network or a big magazine or a big internet website held a press conference and said, guys, we got a lot of shit wrong during this. We were spooked just like you. We were trusting the scientists. It turns out we got a lot of this stuff wrong. But you haven't heard that press conference. On that point,
I'll tell you something very interesting. So in terms of the impact of the media. So initially, we were all told that the vaccine would prevent transmission. We know that was false, right? And Rochelle Walensky, the chair of the CDC, came out and admitted that her optimism from the vaccine, wait for it, came from a CNN news story. That CNN news story, which reported on the results of the trials on the vaccine, was almost verbatim a reproduction of Pfizer's press release.
Yes. And so there was actually an article in a magazine here in the U.S. called The Atlantic, which is kind of a pseudo-intellectual journal, calling for a forgiveness for all of the journalists and all of the scientists who said all of this incorrect information during the heat of the moment. And saying, please forgive all these guys. But you haven't heard the press conference for any of these influencers or reporters or scientists asking for forgiveness. It's almost like they just like to quietly back away from this, and nobody remember what it was they said last year or the year before last. And I don't think that that's probably going to be the best thing for a cohesive society. I think there needs to be some penance. I think there needs to be some admissions of guilt. I think there may even need to be some lawsuits. We need to basically clean out the pipes in order so that because I think what we're facing now is almost a fracturing of society into these very different groups of people. And that's not good. We are all in this together ultimately, and we all need to realize that.
Ken, absolutely. And in fact, that particular point, it goes against what we're also taught in medicine. So as you probably know, when you look at patient complaints to doctors, it isn't because necessarily they made a mistake. It was because of their communication and not admitting and owning up. And, you know, patients appreciate, as a doctor, if you say, for example, I prescribed this drug and I thought it was, but listen, I got it wrong. I'm really sorry. Patients appreciate that. They want their doctors to be open and honest. So they're going completely, you know, this is absolutely, you're right. It's totally the wrong approach. And the longer they go on with this behavior, the more harm, the more damage that's going to be done, the longer it's going to take to regain trust in the medical establishment. And then everybody's worse off.
Absolutely. And I think the potential damage that could be done from this is much more than the harm done to a single patient. This could become a societal level danger of where this could wind up leading to a civil unrest, to a war between two different countries. This could be huge if we don't have some type of peer behind the curtain, if we don't have some kind of apology, some kind of press conference saying, hey, we got a lot of stuff wrong and we're very sorry about that. We are going to make amends. I was wrong about this, but you don't hear any of that. And I think that for a certain segment, a very large segment of society, the fact that we don't have that press conference or we don't have that formal apology that basically I made your life hell for 2 years or 3 years and it didn't amount to anything. It didn't help anybody. It didn't help you. It didn't help your mother. I think a lot of people are waiting for that. And if they don't get that, there's going to be just a level of ill will and vitriol that's just not going to go away until we have that kind of cleansing of the mainstream media narrative.
Absolutely, Ken. Yeah, 100%. And, you know, I've kind of gone through this process a little bit myself because the very early on in the pandemic, I'd taken 2 doses of Pfizer. I went on Good Morning Britain, and I told people that this was, you know, likely to be safe because traditional vaccines are very, very safe. And then I've had to evolve my position as the evidence changed, and I've gone along and been public about it and written about it, and almost completely made a U-turn. But the evidence changed, and I think if public health authorities came out and said, "Listen, this is what we thought at the beginning. New information came to light. It was an emergency. We were panicking. We thought this was a solution moving forward." Then as soon as we realized there was a problem, we were like, okay, let's stop, let's pause. And the good news is, Ken, anyway, certainly with COVID, which is very reassuring, is that the current strain that's circulating, and it's been mutating ever since Wuhan strain, is actually no worse than a bad cold or the flu, which is great news, actually. We should use it, as I say, this is great news, right? People need to stop being worried so much anymore. And then we need to back off in terms of, you know, this max vaccination strategy. Of course, you know, it's and you know, we can discuss it if you want to, but I know it's a controversial area, but certainly breaking down that information data in terms of benefits and harms, and it's very, very shaky now. And we need to first do no harm.
I think many of us in the healthcare sphere were scared to death. I made 2 videos about this back in February of 2020. Very early on, I was watching I watch all international media. I was watching the Chinese media. I was watching foreign media. And initially, the R0 and the infectivity of this looked terrible. And I made a couple of videos that were, looking back now, were much more inflammatory than they needed to be because I believe those initial numbers that were coming out. And I told people, you need gloves, you need a mask, you need a face shield. You need to literally not go out of your house because this is going to be terrible. This is going to be the most monstrous thing we've ever seen in 100 years. Turns out that those numbers were wrong. And so I've since made those videos unlisted so people can't find them because I was wrong in the early stages. And I'm happy to admit that. And I'm with you. I am gleeful. I am ecstatic that this thing is basically evolving down to just a bad flu or a bad cold. That makes me so happy I can't even articulate it. And it should be making everybody happy. But here in the U.S., we're now having rumors, oh, maybe we should bring back masking. Maybe we should, you know, start social distancing again. It's just like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's absolutely madness. And Ken, I completely empathize with you. I remember at the very beginning of the pandemic when we had lockdown early 2020, you know, I was so worried or concerned about obviously this virus that I was getting groceries and I was using like antiseptic to wipe down the packaging of the groceries before opening it and washing my hands constantly.
Absolutely.
Right. So I get it. We were, you know, it's almost like there's a PTSD, right, for a lot of people because we knew what it was like, but we need to just move forward and try and move forward in a positive way. And, you know, and this is maybe another discussion, but I think that there's no doubt the ancestral strain, the Wuhan strain of COVID, certainly for elderly, was pretty devastating. I mean, John Ioannidis breaks it down quite nicely. In fact, quite early on in a CNN report, he said, for the older people and vulnerable people, it was, you know, pretty devastating, way worse than the flu. For middle-aged people, it was actually similar to the flu. And for kids, it was less lethal than the flu, right? And I think if that message had been out there from the beginning, we had focused protection, then we would have been a lot better off. But that didn't happen, unfortunately.
No, I totally agree. So I obviously, Dr. Malhotra and I could talk for hours about all the ways the big food and big pharma have corrupted the current practice of medicine. But I'm going to wrap it up today. And definitely, I want to have you back on, Doctor, multiple times, pretty please. But I want you now to talk to the common man and woman in the street. They have listened to this and they're currently sitting there going, I mean, what the hell do I even do with this information? What should I do? How do I protect myself? How do I protect my family? Not just from vaccines or from viruses, but what do I do about this big pharma cesspool that's going on currently? So please talk to the 1,500 viewers. What are some simple things they can do at home to insulate themselves from the obvious power of these multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical corporations who have established that they don't give a damn about anybody's health. They just care about what's our net profit going to be after the lawsuits. What can just the average person do about this?
It's a great way to finish, Ken. So first and foremost, I think the overall theme, and it doesn't mean all medicine is bad. We're very good at treating acute problems, right? But good health doesn't come out of a medicine bottle in general, right? And one of the things I've done is worked on and tried to look at these communities around the world that have very high longevity and, you know, live to 100 and they're healthy and they're not taking medications. It's because of the environment and the lifestyle, right? So what are the key things? Well, what I tell my patients in very simple terms, you know, poor diet is probably the root cause of many of the chronic disease problems we're facing right now. And the Lancet Global Burden of Disease reports estimates that poor diet is responsible for more disease and death than physical inactivity, smoking, and alcohol combined. So in terms of the hierarchy of things that you should focus on, especially for the American public, it's diet, diet, diet. So what should you do? Well, avoid, you know, I think the two things I think people should avoid are ultra-processed foods. You know, 60% of the calories in the US come from foods that are called ultra-processed. So very simple terms, if it comes out of a packet and you can read 5 or more ingredients, it's likely ultra-processed and best avoided. This even includes packaged bread, for example, right?
Absolutely.
So eat real food and also minimize or eliminate low-quality carbohydrates. That's your refined carbs, your breads, your pastas, your rice, that kind of thing. So it's a relatively lowish carb diet, but it's a real food diet. That's the most important thing.
Yes.
Do that for 4 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks, Ken. For many of these people, they will notice, as my patients, dramatic changes. You know, they eliminate sugar and they just go cold turkey. It doesn't mean forever, but just to kind of recalibrate their bodies, and they suddenly, people feel better. They can't believe how quickly they feel better. And their risk factors obviously will get better, but they'll feel better, right? They'll sleep better. Exercise, keep it simple. Do what you enjoy. You know, I say if you do a 30-minute brisk walk once a day, you're doing pretty well. Yes. You know, if you want to go to the gym, lift weights, all that stuff, all for it. Do what you enjoy. Don't overdo it, but don't sit on your backside for very long periods of time, right? So don't sit for more than 45 minutes at a time. Get up, stretch, whatever else.
Yep.
And then the one of the things I think that's going to be the most interesting as we move forward, the most challenging, but maybe the most important, Ken, is sorting out psychosocial stress or stress. So we know now, certainly as a cardiologist, I can tell you, chronic psychological stress is the same risk for heart disease and a heart attack now as having high blood pressure or diabetes or being a smoker, right? And a lot of us are suffering from that because of societal, the system and the way we work, the way we live. So what can you do? Well, again, do something that's going to reduce your stress levels. So it could be meditation. It could be joining a yoga or Pilates class. It could be just spending more time with friends and family and engaging in more connectivity and simple things like hugging. I mean, I actually advise my cardiac patients with their wives or their husbands or whatever else, girlfriends, boyfriends. I say hug for at least 20 seconds. Right? Hug them for 20 seconds, 10 times a day. It will reduce your cortisol. It'll be better for you. Those simple things, Ken, is what we need to focus on. Eat real food. Don't be sedentary. and really think about reducing your stress levels. And one of the markers of making sure and understanding whether your stress levels are high is, are you getting at least 7 to 7.5 hours, if not 8 hours of good quality sleep a night? And if you're not, then you need to really work on your stress levels. And if you do that, you're going to be better off in the long term, but in the short term as well. And that's it. It's not rocket science.
No, it's not. And I think that's part of the problem with many doctors not recommending this sort of thing is I think a lot of doctors are thinking, so you're telling me I spent 12 years of formal education, and really the most important thing I can tell somebody is to stop drinking lots of alcohol, stop eating high carbohydrate shit food, manage your stress and get good sleep. I could have been a truck driver and told people that. Why did I do all these years of education if that's literally the best medical intervention that I can give my patients is to stop eating high carb, sugar filled, highly processed food and hug the person you love, get good sleep, and go outside and play. Literally, that is the best advice that you can give a patient. But that for many doctors, that doesn't feel very sciencey. It doesn't feel very imminent. And so I think a lot of them are like, I'm not doing that. I've got a reputation to uphold. I'm going to recommend these very complex pharmaceuticals. Dr. Aseem Malhotra, thank you so much for doing this with me. And I would love to have you back on. The comments are full of people saying have him back, and I 100% agree. I'm going to post links where you guys can find Dr. Malhotra in the show notes of this video. Please consider sharing this video with your doctor, with your dietitian, with your healthcare provider, with your mama, because this is the kind of information that is not only going to help the health of the entire world, but it's going to help heal some of the damage that's been done over the last 2 or 3 years to our society as a whole. Thank you so much, Doctor. I'll see you next time.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Look forward to speaking to you again.
Yes, bye-bye.